Have you ever been in the same room as someone you love and felt completely alone? Not because of a fight, not because of a cold shoulder, just invisible. Like the air between you two had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence. That feeling has a name, even if nobody uses it, and St. Teresa of Avila, one of the most brilliant and spiritually sharp minds the Catholic Church has ever produced, saw exactly what that feeling does to a soul, and to a marriage, when it is left to grow unchecked inside a home. This is not a soft story. Teresa was not a soft woman. She was a reformer, a mystic, a doctor of the church, and a woman who crossed 16th century Castile on a mule in summer heat to found convents and fight bishops. She wrote 3 books that are still required reading in seminaries 450 years after her death. When she talked about love, she talked about it the way a surgeon talks about a body, with precision, with urgency, and without sentimentality. And what she saw happening between married people who stopped truly seeing each other was, in her language, a slow spiritual wound that bled quietly until there was almost nothing left. She did not arrive at these conclusions from a distance. Teresa had watched marriages from close range her entire life. She had grown up in a household shaped by loss. She had spent 27 years in a convent where nuns formed bonds and alliances and intimate friendships. And she had watched those bonds calcify over time into something comfortable and hollow. She knew the anatomy of human closeness, and she knew, better than almost anyone of her century, how it died. If you value documented Catholic mysticism and the real writings of the saints, subscribe. It is the best way to support what we do here. And drop a comment telling us what city you are writing from. We want to know where this is reaching. Also, this script is researched and factual. The primary sources here include Teresa of Avila's own interior castle, written in 1577 under the title El Castillo Interior, dictated in 6 days and preserved in the original manuscript now held at the monastery of the Discalced Carmelites in Alba de Tormes, Spain. We also draw from the collected letters of Teresa of Avila, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez in the critical 2-volume edition published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies. Not a summary, not a paraphrase, but the actual letters Teresa wrote to specific people about specific lives, including married women who came to her in confusion and pain. These letters document real conversations, real names, real cities, and real crises in the marriages of 16th century Castile. Now back to the story. Teresa was born on March 28, 1515, in Avila, a walled city in the high plateau of Castile, sitting at an elevation of about 1,130 meters. Cold in winter, exposed in summer, surrounded by granite walls that have stood since the 11th century. Her father, Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, was a wool merchant of Converso descent, meaning his family had converted from Judaism within the previous generation, a fact that followed the family quietly but persistently, because in Castile in 1515, blood records mattered. Her mother, Beatriz de Ahumada, was her father's second wife, 20 years his junior, a woman described in family documents as beautiful and pious and exhausted. She had 9 children. She died when Teresa was 13. That loss was the first real lesson Teresa received about the cost of absence. Her father, by all accounts a devoted man, did not know how to hold the grief the family shared. He managed it. He organized around it. The household continued. Teresa, 13 and already intensely interior, experienced something that she would only name decades later in her autobiography. The sense that everyone in the house was present and nobody was there. Life was going on. The routines were intact, but the presence that had given those routines meaning was gone, and nobody spoke about that. They spoke about everything else. She entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila at age 21 in 1535. After a period of internal conflict she describes in her autobiography, with characteristic honesty, she was not sure she had a vocation so much as she feared that the alternative, marriage, would place her in spiritual danger. This is worth noting. Teresa of Avila, the woman who would spend decades advising married women on the spiritual dangers of their state, chose the convent partly because she was afraid of what marriage did to people. She had watched it. She had seen the particular way that a life built on mutual obligation, children, property, and social performance could swallow a person's interior life whole. She chose the convent and spent 27 years watching the convent do some of the same thing. The Incarnation was not a strict monastery. By the standards of the day, it was almost casual. Nuns received visitors in a parlor. They formed social circles. They kept personal relationships with wealthy benefactors who provided them gifts and company. The convent had, at its peak during Teresa's years there, about 180 women. Far too many for the space and the resources, which meant that many nuns spent significant time outside the enclosure, staying with benefactors, circulating through the city. Teresa herself, by her own admission in the Libro de la Vida, spent years in exactly this kind of half-life, present in the convent but not fully committed, devoted in her prayers some days and distracted for weeks at a time. She describes those years with startling transparency. She was going to prayer and leaving prayer. She was keeping the forms of the religious life and hollowing them out from inside with distraction and comfort seeking. She had friends in the parlor. She had conversations that pleased her. She had routines that felt like virtue because they were orderly and consistent. But she writes in a passage that has been cited in spiritual direction for 4 centuries. I was like someone who runs toward a fire and then turns back and then toward the fire again and then back. Never warm, never cold. Held in the middle by a comfort I was too weak to leave. That middle space, that is what she was diagnosing in herself, in the convent, and years later, in marriages. Because when Teresa eventually experienced what she called her second conversion, around 1554, when she looked at a statue of the wounded Christ and was suddenly struck by the contrast between his suffering and her own mediocrity, she spent years trying to understand the anatomy of spiritual blindness. What exactly happens inside a person, or between 2 people, when presence becomes mere proximity? When sharing a bed is no longer sharing a life? When the other person becomes a piece of furniture, familiar, useful, and completely unseen? She addressed this directly and with sharp precision. In The Interior Castle, her masterpiece, written in 1577 when she was 62 years old and suffering from broken left arm bones from a fall she had taken months earlier, she describes the soul as a castle made of crystal, with many rooms. The center room is where God lives. Every soul, she says, begins in the outer courtyard, and the journey through the rooms is a journey of increasing intimacy with the divine. But she returns, again and again, to one specific danger that she says can stop a person in the outer rooms for an entire lifetime without them ever realizing it. She calls it the habit of self-enclosure that masquerades as love. It works like this. You love someone, you build a life with them. In the beginning, you see them, really see them, their fears, their small joys, the way they go quiet when something bothers them. You pay attention. But over months, over years, the image you carry of them hardens. You stop looking at the actual person and start relating to the version you already know. You stop asking because you think you already know the answers. You stop noticing because the shape of them is so familiar that it no longer triggers curiosity. And you call this stability. You call it comfort. You call it a good marriage. Teresa calls it something else. She uses the Spanish word ensimismamiento, a word that does not translate cleanly into English, but means something like being absorbed into oneself, sealed up in one's own mental world, enclosed in a private country you have stopped inviting anyone else into. And she says this quality is not only spiritually dangerous in prayer, it is lethal in love. Because love, in her framework, is entirely directional. It requires constant orientation toward the other. The moment you stop directing your attention outward toward the actual, living, changing, sometimes inconvenient other person in front of you, you are no longer loving them. You are loving the memory of them. You are loving a portrait you painted yourself and then hung on a wall and decided was finished. She makes this observation not in the abstract, but through specific accounts she recorded from women who came to speak with her. In 1568, while Teresa was in Medina del Campo, a trading city in the province of Valladolid, then one of the most commercially active cities in all of Castile, with a market that handled wool contracts from across the Iberian Peninsula, a woman came to see her. The woman was married, in her mid-30s, from a respectable family. She came not with a crisis, but with something harder to name. She said she felt like a stranger in her own house. Her husband was not cruel. He was not absent in body. He came home every evening. He ate at the table. He slept beside her. But he had not truly looked at her in what she estimated was 3 or 4 years. He spoke to her, but the words felt like words said to a room. She had recently lost a child, a boy who died at 4 months old, and her husband had responded with the efficient kindness of someone handing out medicine. Sympathetic, correct, present for the expected number of days, and then gone. Back to his routines in 3 days. The grief was still in her, unchanged. He did not know. Teresa did not comfort her with softness. She told her something that startled her. She said, "The problem is not what your husband is doing. The problem is what you are both doing. You have both agreed, without saying a word, to stop the work of seeing. You have mistaken the quiet for peace. The quiet is not peace. The quiet is 2 people who have stopped speaking the language that matters." This distinction between the quiet of peace and the quiet of mutual abandonment is one Teresa returned to in her letters repeatedly. In a letter written in 1576 to Doña Luisa de la Cerda, a noblewoman and longtime friend of Teresa's, who was navigating her second widowhood and advising a younger relative on marriage, Teresa wrote with characteristic directness about what makes a household spiritually alive or spiritually dead. She said, "The temperature of a home is set by the attention of the people inside it. When spouses pay attention, genuine, curious, present attention, to each other, something moves through that house that she describes as a current, a warmth, something the children feel without being able to name it, something the servants feel, something that the couple themselves can hardly explain, but that they know has left when it is gone. And when it leaves, she says, people begin filling the house with substitutes, more activity, more obligation, more conversation about logistics, as if busyness can replace presence, cold, empty, moving. Teresa had seen this in the women who came to her. She had seen it in herself, in the early years of her religious life when she had replaced true prayer with the social warmth of the convent parlor. She knew exactly what it felt like to be in the presence of the thing you love most, and to be so wrapped up in your own comfort and your own established rhythms that you were functionally absent. She called it the sin of habituation. And she was not gentle about the word sin. She did not mean a dramatic moral failure. She meant something quieter and for that reason more dangerous. The choice, repeated daily in small and invisible ways, to settle for less than real presence. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Because in her interior castle, in the third dwelling, Teresa describes a type of soul that is, by every visible standard, admirable. These are people who pray regularly, who give to charity, who keep their families in order, who would be called in any parish good Catholics and in any neighborhood good spouses. She does not doubt their sincerity, she does not doubt their effort. But she says that these souls have made an error so subtle that it is almost impossible to see from the outside. They have organized their spiritual lives, and their loving, around the avoidance of disruption. They pray, but only at set times. They love, but only within the framework they have already agreed on. They are devoted, but their devotion has become a system. And a system, she says, cannot love. Only a person can love. And a person loves only when they remain genuinely open to surprise, to need, to the inconvenience of the actual other. This is the passage that made Teresa's spiritual directors nervous, by the way. In the original interior castle, she uses language about these third-dwelling souls that some of her confessors considered almost harsh. She tells them, directly, without cushion, that the greatest danger they face is not sin. It is satisfaction. They are satisfied with what they have built. They are not hungry anymore. And a soul that is not hungry, she says, cannot move forward. It has stopped. And to stop, in her framework, is to begin going backward, because the soul does not exist in a steady state. There is no stable plateau. You're either moving toward the center of the castle or retreating toward the outer walls. And the mechanism that moves you toward the center is not effort alone. It is desire, real desire, the kind that makes you uncomfortable, the kind that notices the person in front of you and wants to know them more than your existing image of them allows. If you are still with this story and it is landing the way it should, subscribe. That is the real way to support this channel. Leave a comment with your city. And know that every claim here comes from documented sources, from Teresa's hand, from her letters preserved in manuscripts across Spain, from the critical editions that scholars have spent decades assembling. These are not stories invented to feel spiritual. These are testimonies. Now back. 1577, October 2nd. Teresa writes the last lines of the interior castle in Toledo. She had started it in June. She had finished in under 6 weeks, writing in the mornings in pain from her arm, while simultaneously managing the affairs of the Carmelite reform movement she had been building for 15 years. At the end, in the seventh dwelling, the innermost room, she returns one last time to the question of what love looks like when it is real, and she says something that stopped her own copyist mid-sentence, according to a note in the margin of one of the early transcriptions. She writes, "The soul that has reached genuine union with God no longer mistakes comfort for love. It has learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person you love is to decide you already know them. The most dangerous thing you can do to a person you love is to decide you already know them." She was writing about prayer. She was also writing about every marriage she had ever observed from close range. These were not separate subjects for Teresa. She saw the interior life and the relational life as governed by the same laws, moved by the same forces, damaged by the same errors. The man who stops truly looking at his wife has made the same interior move as the soul that stops truly listening in prayer. The woman who responds to her husband's grief with efficient sympathy and then returns to her routines has performed the same act as the person who goes through the motions of the rosary while thinking about dinner. The mechanics are identical. The damage is identical. And the recovery, Teresa was very clear on this, requires the same radical decision, to stop managing and start seeing. What does that mean practically? Teresa was not a romantic. She did not talk about love as a feeling that should be preserved or a mood that should be chased. She talked about love as a practice, a discipline, really, that requires daily exercise, daily choice, daily willingness to be inconvenienced by the reality of another person. And the core of that practice, in her account, is attention, real attention, the kind that requires you to leave your own head and enter the reality of another person. Not the version of them that lives in your comfortable internal model, the actual, present, breathing, changing, sometimes exhausting person across the room. She described this in terms of what she called the prayer of recollection, the practice of pulling yourself out of the scattered noise of your own thoughts and directing your full attention toward another, she used it for prayer. But in her letters, particularly in the ones addressed to lay people navigating marriage and family life, she made explicit that the same movement of the will is required between spouses. You have to choose, actively and repeatedly, to recollect yourself, to gather your wandering attention back from your own preoccupations, your own established images, your own comfortable certainties, and to offer it fully to the person in front of you, not as a performance, not as a scheduled weekly effort, as a continuous orientation of your will toward their reality. She said this was harder than most people admitted, because by the time you have lived with someone for 10 or 15 years, you have built a very elaborate internal model of who they are. And that model is comfortable. It is efficient. It allows you to predict and respond without the exhausting work of real attention. But it is a ghost. The person it represents has been changing every year, every month, through every grief and joy and private fear. And if you are only ever responding to the model, you are not responding to them. You are, in every meaningful sense, alone in that house. Alone, together, unfed. The women who came to Teresa in crisis after crisis were not, for the most part, in bad marriages by any visible measure. They were in good marriages that had gone quiet in a specific way. The husbands had not left. The structure was intact. The bills were paid. The children were healthy. The routines were running smoothly. But something essential had stopped. And Teresa, listening, would ask them the same question every time. When did you last tell him something that surprised him? When did he last ask you something that showed he knew you had changed? These were not therapeutic questions in the modern sense. Teresa was not a therapist. She was a woman who had spent 30 years studying the interior life with the same rigor that a surgeon brings to anatomy, and she had concluded that surprise, the experience of encountering the other as genuinely new, genuinely unknown, genuinely more than your existing picture of them, is not a luxury in love. It is the blood. Without it, what you call love is actually memory, affection for a fixed image. And fixed images, she wrote, do not grow. They do not ask anything of you. They do not change you. And for Teresa, love that does not change you is not love at all. It is decoration. Now back to that woman in Medina del Campo, 1568. 15. Teresa met with her 3 times over the span of about 2 weeks. In the second conversation, according to what Teresa recorded in a letter to Maria de San Jose, one of her closest Carmelite sisters and the prioress of the Seville convent founded in 1575, the woman had gone home and tried something that felt almost embarrassing in its smallness. She had asked her husband at dinner a question she had never asked him before, not about the household, not about his business dealings, not about the children's schooling or the servants' wages, something about him, something she genuinely did not know. She had asked him what he feared most. He had gone very quiet. And then, after a long pause, long enough that she thought she had embarrassed him and almost apologized, he had said something that undid her. He said he feared dying without having been truly useful to anyone. He was a successful man by the measures of his city. He had built something. He had a respected name. But the fear was there, unchanged, deep inside him for years, possibly for decades, and she had never known. Not because he had hidden it deliberately, but because she had stopped asking the kinds of questions that would have found it. She had been managing him, predicting him, relating to the image she had assembled of him for so long that the actual man had become almost invisible inside it. That conversation, Teresa wrote, was the beginning of something. Not a rescue, not a transformation, a beginning. A small reorientation of attention that created the possibility of something real being built again. Teresa did not say the marriage was fixed. She said 2 people had, for one evening, actually looked at each other, and that single act of seeing, one real question, one honest answer, had reminded both of them that there was something there worth looking at. Teresa's framework for why marriages go invisible is, if you read it carefully, a precise spiritual diagnosis with 3 distinct stages. In the first stage, the spouses genuinely see each other. They are curious. They are surprised. They are invested in knowing. This stage requires no effort because it is fed by novelty and desire. The appetite for the other is natural and strong and doesn't need to be summoned. In the second stage, habituation sets in. The novelty fades. The effort to pay real attention now has to come not from pleasure but from will, from a deliberate decision to keep looking, even when looking no longer comes automatically. This is the stage where most couples, without realizing it, begin the transition from love to management. They are still affectionate. They are still loyal. They still use the word love every day. But they have started running on habit, and habit requires no real presence, no real seeing, no real risk. In the third stage, and this is the one she speaks of with genuine alarm, the habit has become so entrenched that the couple can no longer tell the difference between it and love. They call the habit peace. They call the routine devotion. They call the familiar silence intimacy. And if someone were to tell them the truth, that they are 2 people living in close proximity who have not genuinely seen each other in years, They would be offended, because from the inside, the habit feels indistinguishable from the real thing. This third stage is what Teresa calls the sleep of the soul, and she uses that language. Sleep, because sleep is not absence. The sleeping person is still in the house. They are still breathing. Their warmth is still there beside you, but they are not available to you. They cannot hear you. They cannot respond to anything new. And if you try to speak to them about something real, something that has changed in you or in the world, you get back only the automatic phrases of someone half awake. Fine. Good. How was your day? I know. You? No. Nothing. The sharpest line Teresa ever wrote about this kind of marital sleep appears not in the interior castle, but in a letter written in 1579 to a young noblewoman in Seville whose name does not survive in the indexed collections, but who appears in the letters of Maria de San Jose as a woman in her early to mid-20s, married approximately 2 years, beginning to feel the first subtle signs of the drift. Teresa's advice was 3 sentences long. She wrote, "Do not let him predict you. Do not let yourself predict him. The day you both become fully predictable to each other is the day you begin to disappear." 3 sentences. One of the most precise diagnoses of marital entropy ever committed to paper. And Teresa of Avila wrote it as a practical instruction to a young woman who probably read it once, folded it, and tucked it somewhere. Predictability. That is the word she lands on. Because predictability sounds like stability, and we are taught to value stability, and so the danger hides inside something that looks like virtue. But Teresa's distinction is surgical. There is the predictability of character, of integrity, reliability, being someone your spouse can trust. And then there is the predictability of a person who has stopped growing, stopped changing, stopped surprising anyone, including themselves. The first kind is the foundation of a real marriage. The second kind is the announcement that the person has decided they are finished becoming. And a person who has decided they are finished becoming cannot be truly loved. They can only be maintained. Teresa connects this explicitly and deliberately to the spiritual life. Because she had seen both states from the inside, she knew what it felt like to be a soul that was growing, genuinely restless, genuinely hungry, genuinely being changed by grace from one year to the next. And she knew what it felt like to be a soul that had organized itself around comfort and called that organization holiness. She said the sensation was almost identical from the inside. The comfortable soul feels peaceful. The growing soul feels disturbed. And the whole difference between them is whether they are actually moving toward the center of the castle or just sitting in a very nicely arranged outer room, lighting candles and calling it arrival. Marriage, in her vision, is subject to the same law. A marriage that is actually alive will have a quality of productive disruption to it. Not conflict, not drama, not the exhausting chaos of 2 people at war, but the kind of ongoing friction that comes from 2 people who are still genuinely encountering each other, still finding things they did not expect, still being changed by what they discover, still occasionally surprised by the person they have lived beside for a decade. When that quality disappears entirely and the house goes smooth and frictionless and quiet, that is not necessarily good news. It may mean that both people have stopped growing separately and stopped encountering each other truly. The silence sounds like peace. It is actually 2 people who have stopped asking. 2 people who have agreed, silently and without ceremony, that the investigation is over. In 1580, 2 years before her death, Teresa wrote one of her last long letters to a married laywoman named Doña Ana de Jimena, who had been consulting her periodically for several years. Teresa was 65. She was in Valladolid. She was clearly ill. Her letters from this period are shorter and more direct than those of earlier decades, as if she no longer had the energy for the careful pastoral framing she had used with lay people when she was younger. She drops the cushioning. She speaks plainly. She writes about the specific danger that she had seen undo more marriages than infidelity or cruelty ever had. She calls it the habit of charitable indifference, by which she meant the posture of a spouse who has decided, out of a kind of soft and well-meaning love, to stop asking hard questions, to stop being genuinely curious, to stop introducing any element of real encounter, all in the name of keeping the peace, not causing trouble, not unsettling the system that has been built and is running and is being called a good life. She says this posture feels like love. It sounds like love. It calls itself by love's name every day. But it is, in its actual structure, a form of abandonment that is particularly difficult to name and therefore particularly difficult to heal. Because the abandoned person cannot point to any single act of cruelty. There is no wound they can show to anyone. There is only the slow suffocation of being in a house where nobody is actually looking for them anymore. Nobody is asking who they are becoming. Nobody is curious about what is changing in them. Nobody is treating them as a soul still in motion, still unfinished, still worth the risk of genuine attention. She writes, "The kindest thing one spouse can do for the other is to remain genuinely interested, not as a performance, not as a duty that appears on a list of marital obligations, but as an act of real reverence for the soul God has placed beside you. Reverence for the soul God has placed beside you. That phrase is the hinge of everything Teresa believed about marriage and about love in any form. Because reverence is not affection. You can feel affection for furniture. Reverence is the response you have when you are in the presence of something larger and more mysterious than yourself. And Teresa's claim, radical even now in any century, is that your spouse is exactly that. Not a possession, not a familiar, not a problem that has been solved. A soul, an interior castle of their own, with rooms you have never entered, with depths God placed there before you ever met, that are not yours to seal off by the slow accumulation of familiarity. The moment you treat them as fully known, fully mapped, fully understood, you have stopped revering them. And the moment you stop revering them, you have, in the deepest sense, stopped loving them, even if you still say the word every morning and mean it. This is what Teresa saw in the couples who came to her over 35 years of advising lay people and religious alike. She saw people who had, with the best intentions and all the loyalty in the world, committed the specific error of finishing each other, of deciding at some point they could not name that the other person was complete, that there was nothing left to discover, that the investigation had arrived at its conclusion. And she saw, with the clear and practiced eyes she had trained over decades of interior work, exactly what that decision cost them. It cost them the aliveness of the house. It cost them the kind of love that actually changes a person. And it cost them the chance, the one chance they had, living beside each other every day, to be known, genuinely known, not managed, not remembered, not maintained, known by the one person in the world they had chosen before God to live beside. October 4th, 1582. Teresa of Avila died at 9 in the evening in the Carmelite convent in Alba de Tormes after months of illness. She was 67 years old. The nuns who attended her described her final hours as extraordinarily peaceful. A woman who seemed, they said, to be looking at something that made her face completely still, but not empty. Still in the way that full attention is still. Present in the way that a person is present when they have finally stopped managing and started seeing. The last thing she was recorded saying, according to testimony given in her beatification process in 1614, was not a prayer for the dying, or a farewell, or a theological statement. She said in Spanish, "Al fin, Señor, soy hija de la Iglesia." In the end, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church. Some commentators have spent centuries focusing on the word Lord, some on daughter. But Teresa, who had spent a lifetime studying the interior life, who had identified attention as the currency of love, who had watched marriages go cold and quiet in houses where people had stopped looking, Teresa ended by announcing herself, by naming herself, by being in her last breath present and seen and particular. Not a general soul, not an abstraction, a daughter, known. Her body was interred twice, the first time in Alba de Tormes, then removed by her close friend and confessor, Geronimo Gracian, and taken to Avila in 1585. Then ordered back to Alba de Tormes in 1586, after a jurisdictional dispute involving the Duke of Alba that required papal intervention. Her right arm was removed as a relic and is now preserved in the Carmelite convent of Avila. Her heart is in a separate reliquary, also in Alba de Tormes. The left hand was taken to Lisbon. Even after death, she was distributed, present in parts, in multiple places, in several houses at once. And the manuscript of the interior castle, the book she wrote in pain in 6 weeks at 62, the one that contained her most precise diagnosis of what love requires and what it costs when it goes blind, was hidden for years by the Carmelite nuns who feared the Inquisition's interest in a woman who wrote about mystical union and the inner life of the soul with such authority. It was copied in secret across at least 3 convents, passed hand to hand, preserved by women who understood what was in it. It was finally published in Salamanca in 1588, 6 years after Teresa's death. The woman in Medina del Campo, the one who asked her husband what he feared, who sat across the dinner table in 1568 and finally, for the first time in years, asked a question that had no certain answer. Teresa never names her in any documented source. We do not know her family name, or her husband's trade, or whether the conversation at dinner became something larger, something sustained, something that changed the temperature of that house in Medina for the years that followed. What Teresa wrote in her letter to Maria de San Jose is only that the woman came back for a third meeting and that she was different in a way Teresa described in 5 words. In Spanish, había vuelto a mirar. She had returned to looking. That is the entire report. A woman in 1568, in a wool trading city in Castile across a dinner table, asked one honest question. And Teresa of Avila, mystic, doctor of the church, woman who crossed a country on a mule and wrote books that are still read in seminaries, recorded it as a spiritual event worth noting. Because in her framework, it was. Because in her framework, The moment two people in a quiet house decide to stop managing each other and start seeing each other, that is not a small domestic adjustment. That is the turning of a soul back toward the center of the castle. The letter she wrote about that woman is stored today in the archives of the Discalced Carmelites in Seville, one of 158 surviving letters Teresa wrote between 1546 and 1582. 158 letters documenting real conversations, real crises, real marriages, real people who came to her with the wounds that the absence of attention makes in a person over time. One letter, one woman, one question at a table, and a man who did not know that anyone was still looking for him, until she was.